In today's lecture, we are going to talk about measuring the economy. We are going to cover the following topics. We want to ask how to quantify the economic performances of a nation, why we can compute GDP using different methods. In here, we are going to talk about 3 methods. Then we will talk about the detail about how to compute GDP. Then we want to ask what can be the components of GDP. In particular, we are going to look at it from the expenditure approach. That is the term that we are going to talk about today. Finally, we want to ask, is GDP a good measurement for the standard of living or welfare of a nation? To answer these questions, we will go through the outline as follows. We want to talk about the detail for GDP. We want to talk about the circular flow of income, such that we will be able to answer the question why there are 3 methods for computing the GDP. Then, to talk about how to compute GDP, we will talk about the terminologies related to compute the GDP, and then we will talk about the 3 methods for computing the GDP. After that, we are going to talk about the components of the GDP, especially from the perspective of expenditure. At the end, we will talk about what can be the missing components of the GDP measurements. So now let's begin with our today's lecture by looking at the question how to quantify the economic performances of a nation. When we talk about the economic performances of a nation, the key variable we look at a lot of time is called GDP. We use GDP to describe the performance of a nation. We say that when some countries' income is high and some countries' income is low, we compare the GDP per capita across countries. When we say when the economy is growing fast, we compare the GDP for a country across time. Therefore, we focus a lot on GDP. So then, what is GDP? You may already know that from the class The Principle of Economics, or you may already know that when you were in high school. GDP is the abbreviation for Gross Domestic Product. G means growth. It is about the total market value created. In here, we care about the total value created instead of net. It's because we care more about how much is produced. So we look at the total market value. Then how about D? The D represents domestic. It is about within a country's border. If you may recall from what you learned before, you may learn something called GNP. In there, the N represents the nationality. Given that when we are talking about a country's performances, we care more about how a nation is doing within the country's border. Therefore, we focus more on GDP instead of GNP. Then the last one, the P, represents the product, which is about how much is produced. When we want to talk about how much is produced, we need to specify what time period that we are interested in. If we do not specify that, we do not know the total amount of the goods that is produced is from the Stone Age to nowadays, or it is from last hour to now. So we need to specify the period of interest. And a lot of time, we care about how much is produced for a year or for a quarter. For example, we talk about the GDP of 2021. We talk about the GDP in 2020. We talk about the GDP in the first quarter of 2021, or the second quarter, or the third quarter, or the fourth quarter of the 2021. So the formal definition for GDP is the market value of the final goods and services newly produced within a country's border during some specific period of the time. The key word here, the final goods and services newly produced, is related to growth and product. And the other keyword within a country's border in here is about domestic. So how to come up with GDP? The most straightforward way to come up with GDP is to sum up all the market value of all the goods produced for a country within its country border. So how to do that? Well, if we think about the GDP for New Zealand, and if New Zealand produces apple, then what we do is to get the price for apple and the quantity for apple. We have the product for that, and then we are going to get the market value of the apples that are produced in New Zealand. If New Zealand produces not only apples but also kiwi, you also need to get the price and quantity for kiwi and multiply them up, and then you are going to get the total market value of the kiwi that is produced in New Zealand. Then we need to add up all the value of the goods that is produced in New Zealand, and then we sum it up, and then we are going to have the sum product of the price and the quantity for all the goods that are produced in New Zealand. So this is what we called the first perspective about how to come up with the GDP. That is by adding up the total market value of the goods that is produced, and it is very straightforward. Then, is there any other way to come up with GDP? The answer is yes, and I will talk about that next. So what we know is that for whatever amount of the good that is produced, it has to be purchased by someone else. It needs to be bought by household, by government. If it is not bought domestically, it can be sold abroad and becomes the exports. Therefore, whatever goods that is produced need to be bought by someone. If it is not bought by someone, it will be as if it is dumped into the sea, and we don't want that. Therefore, a lot of time we assume that all the goods are produced need to be purchased by someone. Therefore, the total value of the goods that is produced need to be equal the total amount that is spent for buying the goods. So here comes the second perspective for how to coming up with the GDP. What we do is we add up the total expenditure people spend on domestically produced final goods and services. And I call this the buyer's perspective for how to come up with GDP. On the other hand, there is another perspective for coming up with GDP. We say that when the producers produce goods, they need to hire workers and they may need to rent capitals. When they hire workers, they need to pay wages. When they rent capital, they need to pay interests. Therefore, once they sold their goods, they have the money to pay the workers the wages and the capital owners the interests, and for all the other amount that is left will become the profit of the producer. Therefore, we say that the total value of the good that is sold will become the income of all the factor of productions. That can be wages, can be interests, can be profit. Therefore, we say that the third perspective for coming up with the GDP is to add up the total income earned by the domestically owned factor of production, and I call it the buyer's perspective. Therefore, in here, it is quite clear that there are various ways we can come up with the GDP. We can coming up by adding up the total value of the goods that is produced. We can add up the total expenditure that people spend for buying the goods. We can also add up the total income that people earn when offering the factor of production. The factor of production can be capital, can be labor, can be entrepreneurship. So let me summarize the discussion in here with the circular flow of income. Under this circular flow of income, we have households and we have firms. The households provide the factor of production, for example, labor and capital, to the firms. And then the firms need to pay them the income in exchange for their contribute to the production. So they pay the wages, pay the interest, for example. And then once the firms produces goods, it sells the goods back to the household, and the household need to pay to acquire the goods. Therefore, we claim that the total payment to the factor of production need to be equal the total value of the goods that is produced and equal to the total expenditure the household spent for buying the goods. Therefore, there are three ways to come up with the GDP. We call it the product approach, the expenditure approach, and the income approach. Before we talk about how to compute GDP in detail, there are three terms that I would like to talk about and define it before we move on to the next step about computing the GDP. So the first terminology I would like to define is called the final goods. The final goods are goods sold to be the final users. The second term I would like to introduce is called intermediate goods. It defined as goods produced by a firm and then sold and used by another firm as an input. The last term I would like to define is called value added. It is the value of a firm's output minus the value of the intermediate goods that the firm used to produce that product. Now let me give you an example about how to differentiate those three terms: final goods, intermediate goods, and the value added. So the example I want to give you is the cheesecake. We know that when we make cheesecake, we need cream cheese, egg, sugar, and pie crust. If the cream cheese is worth $3, the egg is worth $1, the sugar is worth $1, and the pie crust is worth $2. Then now we want to look at what will be the final goods, the intermediate goods, and the value added for three different cases. So now let's look at the first case. The cheesecake factory sells the cheesecake for $10. We buy cheesecake directly from the factory, and the item 1 to 4 are purchased by the factory for producing the cheesecake. So then under this case, what will be the final goods? Given that we buy the cheesecake and eat it, we are the final user of the cheesecake. Therefore, the final goods is the cheesecake. Then what is the intermediate goods? We define the intermediate goods as the good that is produced by one firm and used as an input by the other firm. In this case, because the cheesecake factory buys the cream cheese, egg, sugar, and pie crust, therefore, and then they use those to produce the cheesecake. Therefore, the value of the cheese, cream cheese, the eggs, the sugar, and the pie crust belong to the value of the intermediate goods. Finally, we want to know what is the value added of this factory. In this case, we know that the cheesecake is sold for $10. That is the total market value of the goods that is produced by the factory, $10. And then the value of the intermediate goods includes $3 for cheese, $1 for egg, $1 for sugar, and $2 for pie crust. And then they add up to be $7. Therefore, we say that the value added by the factory equals 3 because it is 10. That is the total market value of the goods that is produced by the cheesecake factory minus the value of the intermediate good that they put into the production process, which equals $7. So 10 minus 7 equals $3. So now let's look at the second case. The second case is a little different. Under this case, we buy cheesecake from the bakery, and the bakery buys the cheesecake from the cheesecake factory and sell it for $15. So what's the final goods under this case? Well, given that we are still the final user because we eat a cheesecake, so the final good is the cheesecake bought from the bakery. But then what is the intermediate goods? The intermediate goods for the bakery is also the cheesecake. But then, so what is the difference between the cheesecake that we eat, which is the final good, versus the cheesecake that is the intermediate goods for the bakery? It turned out that the bakery buys the cheesecake from the factory. They probably put it in a gift box such that you can give it as a gift, or they provide the place such that you can have a very cozy, comfortable afternoon tea at the bakery. Therefore, the bakery not only provides the cake, but it also provides the services. Therefore, the bakery also creates some value in between the cheesecake produced to the cheesecake consumed. And how much is the value added for the bakery? Given that the cheesecake is the product that purchased by the bakery, and the bakery put it into its packages of the services that they provide. So the value added for the bakery is the total market value of the goods, which is the $15 they sell for the cheesecake. And the intermediate good value is $10, which is the value they pay for the cheesecake from the factory. The value added for the bakery is 15 minus 10, which equals 5. Now let's look at the third case, which is that we make the cheesecake by ourselves. Then what will be the final goods? Well, given that we are the final users, even though we eat the cheesecake, but in fact we also go to the market and buy the cheese, the egg, the sugars, and pie crust. So under the computation and under the definition of the final goods, given that we go to the market and buy those ingredients, the final goods under this case will be the cream cheese, the egg, the sugar, and the pie crust. And there is no intermediate goods under this case. And then, so what will be the value added under this case? Well, given that we go to the market to buy those ingredients, the value added of the cream cheese maker will be $3. The value added of the egg producer is $1 under this case, assuming that they can produce it from nothing to the cream cheese and eggs. No other purchases from the other firms. The value added for the sugar producer is $1, and the value added of the pie crust producer is $2. And then so under this case, the value added will be 3 plus 1 plus 1 and plus 2, which equals 7. Therefore, from this example, you can clearly see that even though it is the same cheesecake that you've eaten, when it is produced by a factory or it is purchased by a bakery that is from the factory and then sell it to you, the total market value of your consumption of the cheesecake can be different. Under the first case, the total market value of the cheesecake is $10. For the second case, the total value of the cheesecake is $15. And for the third case, the total value of the cheesecake is $7. That is because when the cheesecake is produced by a factory, the factory also contributes to the production process, and that production process is valued in dollars. In our case, this value added is $3. When the cheesecake is sold to the bakery adds the services for providing the cheesecake. They also adding the value to the whole consumption process. In our case, it values $5. Therefore, there is a question I would like you to think about, that for a country that if it has a lot of home production, how will that affect the GDP of the nation? And we will discuss that in our live session. I hope that you guys now find comfortable with these three terms: final goods, intermediate goods, and the value added. If you haven't feel comfortable about these three terms, you need to go back and read a note or the textbook or watch the video again to repeat this part to make sure that you understand these three terms, and then we can move on to talk about the next topic, which is about the details for computing the GDP.